Namaskar, good evening. The International Museum Day is being celebrated across the world today. Behind me, you see one of the most famous museums in the world, the Louvre in Paris, France. A museum that attracts close to 8.6 million people in a year, in spite of having entry prices that would roughly be around rupees 1100 per person. Compare that to Indian museums, who have a footfall of less than a lakh per museum per year, in spite of having entry prices again close to rupees 20 to 25 per person. What explains this gap in interest, is what we are going to understand today on the day when we celebrate museums across the world. Hello and welcome to StudyIQ IAS English. I am Bhuvan as we seek to understand today in this special presentation the history of museums in India, the role and purpose they serve, what are the expectations of the public, whether they are being met, and what indeed is the way forward. A comprehensive look at museums and the story of museums in India. First up, let's try and understand what indeed is a museum. Now, the International Council of Museums defines museums as something that researches, collects, conserves, interprets and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. At the same time, it is something that fosters diversity and sustainability. Indeed, the operative part of this whole definition comes here. The participation of communities is what builds a museum. Indeed, without a community, a museum wouldn't exist, and without a museum, the story of the community is lost. At the same time, the definition says that it should strive to educate and entertain. It's not just about information, it should also bind the audience, take the attention of the audience for itself. Having understood now what indeed is the definition of a museum, let's try and go forward and see what exactly is the origin of museum. Now, the story so goes that in ancient Greece, the philosophers, the intellectuals, they would gather around and then they would philosophize. They would reflect and ruminate over the issues of the day. So, the word museum comes from the ancient Greek museon, which means seat of muses. As I told you, it was used as a philosophical institution or a place of contemplation, a place of reflection, where you would think over the issues of the day. Now, coming to the types of museums that have so far been introduced in India, well, we have these particular types. Some museums that are under national category, some museums that serve the state, then we have site-specific museums, archaeological museums, memorial museums such as the one in Jallianwala Bagh, and thereafter we have museums dedicated to particular sectors, science and tech, religion, spirituality, all of that. Given that we have and we boast of such rich culture and tradition in our country, our tangible and intangible heritage is par excellence, par none. What explains then that in spite of having the structural information that we have, why haven't Indian museums done as good as they should have done? Why have they lagged behind, say, the Louvre or, say, the other bigger museums in London or New York? So obviously, there exists problems. We will understand that in this video too. Going forward, now we understand and take a look at the history of museums in India. Now, we have had this particular tradition where chitrashalas were in place before, say, the museum. The concept of museum was first introduced even in the consciousness of human mankind. Right? So, we have had chitrashalas and indeed the Bharut railings. They speak about stories from Jataka tales. Storytelling is indeed an inherent part of museums. They indeed convey a story of that particular time to us in the 21st century. Again, at the same time, you had emperors who would have their private collections. They'll probably have something added to those private collections, something came from outside. Now, not often was this available for public consumption. Not often were the public allowed to see what was the emperor collecting. Thus, the first instance of museum in India is by the Asiatic Society, founded by William Jones, and the first museum comes up in 1814, which was eventually opened to the public in 1848, close to 30 years after its opening. Thereafter, we understand that since independence, museums have been under the direct control of Ministry of Culture, and more specifically the Archaeological Survey of India, founded by Alex Cunningham in the year 1861, which its headquarters in New Delhi. Now please understand, the ASI, close to a 160-year-old organization, our country, close to, with its immense history and its heritage and its tradition and its rich culture, art, music, food, everything comes together. And yet, what has happened is that our story has not been preserved and conserved and communicated to the extent that we would have liked. Thus, when we go forward, we look at the national museums of India, the museums of eminence and importance that we should be aware of. Two in New Delhi, that's the National Museum, and the NGMA, the National Gallery of Modern Art. Thereafter, we have two in Kolkata, the Indian Museum and the Victoria Memorial Hall. May I inform you at this moment that the Asiatic Society Museum that was set up by the Asiatic Society, that eventually metamorphosed and became the Indian Museum. Thereafter, we have museums in Mumbai, in Bengaluru, in Nagarjunakonda, Goa, Hyderabad, spread across the length and breadth of the country. In spite of such massive network, in spite of having these institutions, what explains the failing of Indian museums? Why is it that today the first plan for any family would probably be to visit a mall or a market, but not a museum? Probably a fancy kids play cafe or a cafeteria, but not a museum. Why is the question which we will seek to address in this presentation. Thus, we come to the question indeed, why are museums important after all? Why should we pay attention to them? Well, they are the custodians and repository of our heritage, of our culture. They hold the stories that may be lost in the annals of time. They take us back to a time when India was being born and formed. India was in its formative years. They tell us the story of the period and the story of the people of that time. They serve not just, as I told you, to inform, but also to educate and entertain. And communities form an inherent part. There is a bi-directional relationship that exists between museums and communities. At the same time, they serve to connect our past, present, and future in a single strand. Where we have come, where have we reached, and where ought to be we be going. At the same time, museums also help us foster a spirit of national unity. They make us appreciate the immense diversity of our country, not just in thought, but in our attire, our food, our culture, our traditions, the way of life. Indeed, museums capture that essence for times to come, which is why it becomes of utmost importance to all of us that museums be empowered and be given much more than what they have been given so far. For if that doesn't happen, then there is a large possibility that the immense stories of India, from north to south, from east to west, they might eventually be lost. As so many traditions have been lost in the passage of time, we risk doing that again, not learning from our mistakes. When we go forward, we try and understand the challenges now. Now that I've painted this doom and gloom story for you, what exactly are the challenges that Indian museums face? Number one, lack of vision and expertise. This one-size-fits-all policy, one exam cleared, and you're the master of ceremonies in every project that you enter. No specialization, but only general people heading organizations, the IAS heading as a director of a museum. Indeed, it begs the question, why them? Why not a specialist in place? After all, in the circles, in the bureaucratic circles, the directorship of a museum is often seen as shunned posting, as not a coveted post amongst the officers. Why not give it to someone who would probably add value to that institution? Again, at the same time, untrained HR. You and I go visit a museum. Therein you find a particular person who introduces themselves or himself as a guide. And as soon as the tour begins, you know that the person has no information. There's nothing that he can add besides what has already been stated, say, online. There are no stories to inform you of the character, of the relevance of the particular artifact that you are listening to or watching. At the same time, the lack of scientific preservation practices and security is a major issue. So much so that in the Indian Museum in Kolkata, just a few years ago, we have had two particular artifacts that were lost, that were stolen and damaged. A Yakshi statue of 2 BC and a Mauryan lion of 3 BC, lost due to callous attitude of the museum personnel. A definite indication that there is a lack of scientific management and training in the handling of these precious artifacts. At the same time, our museums suffer from an academia and a museum disconnect. After all, museums indeed will be storing the particular entity, but then the understanding of that entity, the contextual relevance of that particular artifact can only be provided by researchers and intellectuals who are engaged in deep study of that particular time period or that particular kingdom. Unless this connect and synergy is ensured on an urgent basis, we do risk making sure that our stories, as I tell you, will fade into oblivion. Again, the lack of funding is a major issue. When you do not have the funds and finances, how are you going to do the maintenance and the learning that is necessary for the interpretation of the artifacts in the museum? Less than 1% of our budget is often allocated for the conservation of museums, specifically to the ASI. Again, at the same time, our museums suffer from a lack of autonomy. They do not have independent decision-making bodies, often dependent on the ASI headquarters or the Ministry of Culture to have even a basic partnership with an institution. This centralization of decision-making has impeded the growth of Indian museums. And the last one, which is my personal favorite, displays without any context. You walk into a museum, you see a particular artifact, but you have no information about it. Where is it from? Which period did it belong to? What's the relevance of the particular artifact? No information provided. It's like watching a particular lifeless object just kept. No information, no learnings, no outcomes. Indeed, when you factor in all of these issues together, you understand that museums are underappreciated, often neglected, and that onus lies as much as on the government, it lies on us too. Like I told you, museum is not often the first destination for any family or for any group of friends. Why? After all, it does take us back in time to the time when India was being formed. The story of those people, those traditions, those kingdoms, those are often underappreciated. When we go forward, we try and understand the steps now that have been taken to address those challenges that I just informed you about. So, a 14-point agenda by the Ministry of Culture was mooted in the year 2009. Now, it spoke about scientific management and scientific display. It also spoke about having proper signages, making sure everything was accessible, that there would be shops and souvenir collection would be allowed. There would be multimedia introduced for interpretation of the artifact that is kept in front of you. Various audience segments would be targeted: children, senior citizens, women. All of them would be targeted so that interest could be generated in museums and museology. Publicity and acquisition has also been given a thrust So much so that since 2014, 300 plus artifacts that originally belonged to India have now been returned to India. With this influx of our artifacts now coming back to their homeland, to their rightful place, do we not need a strategy to make sure that we are able to protect and preserve and conserve these valuable artifacts that are finally coming back home? Museum digitization is also a major thrust area of the government, making sure that every artifact is online with the information that it carries, that it deserves. At the same time, a website has been launched, museumsofindia.gov.in. May I implore you to go ahead and check out the website. It is indeed a learning experience to understand the rich history that we talk about. What does it mean to have a rich history, unless and until you're not able to preserve it, conserve it, and showcase it indeed to the outside world? Capacity building and training has also been a major thrust area of the government, with partnerships between educational institutions for the purpose of training of these individuals now being given a renewed thrust. At the same time, a focus on new museums has also come up. We have had the Partition Museum in Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar. We have had the PM Sangrahalaya closer home here in New Delhi. All of these add to the value, the importance of museums in public consciousness. And like I told you, with all of the artifacts now coming back home, we have had the talks about Kohinoor. In fact, we had a video on StudyIQ English IAS just a couple of days ago where we spoke about the ministry's efforts to bring back Kohinoor and the Amravati marbles. Precious artifacts that were once stolen or taken away from us, now coming back home. Can we afford to be complacent insofar as museums are concerned? After all, the question will so arise that if they are in safe and scientific custody there, can the Indians do the same? We need to make sure that we are prepared as the groundwork is being laid for the return of these particular valuable items. Okay? At the same time, please understand that this whole renewed thrust on museums is an indication that we have finally begun to arrive on the world stage. We have begun to appropriate what's rightfully ours. No more will India step back when it is confronted with its own artifacts that are in possession of other countries. That augurs well for us, but then it's of extreme importance that we give museums the importance they deserve. Or else, the museums will not give importance to our story in the coming days, in the coming years, and in the coming decades. Which is why, my dear viewers, before I wrap up this small video, may I pose a very small question to you. Are our museums failing us? Or indeed, are we failing our museums? Of course, the museums do have a responsibility. No one is denying that. But then, as a viewer, can you put your hand on your heart and say that museums are an interest area for you? Can you tell me that museums are a part of your itinerary when you visit a new city or town in India? Which is what explains that the Louvre in France may probably have 8.6 million visitors per year, but our museums lack that kind of footfall. It is upon you and I, my dear viewer, to make sure that museums are central to our focus, central to our existence, and that we work towards making a more inclusive, more dominant, and more accessible museums in the times to come. On that note, it's a wrap from Bhuvan Apurvaja here for StudyIQ English IAS. Till I see you tomorrow again with a new topic at the same time, 9 p.m. IST. Thank you for watching.